Welcome to How You Livin', a transformative podcast featuring best-selling author, inspirational speaker, and minister, Dr. Rick Rigsby. And now, Dr. Rick.
Hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to talk to you about storytelling, very specifically, the power of a well-told story. Friends, I always enjoy watching movies nominated for Academy Awards, and 2022's list did not disappoint. Among them, Picture of the Year, Coda. The movie features the character Ruby Rossi, portrayed brilliantly by Emilia Jones, whose character depicts a teenage girl who is the only hearing member of a deaf family. The family is in the very competitive commercial fishing business in Massachusetts, and Ruby is their only access to a hearing world. Here's the tension. Ruby loves her family and has interpreted for her mother, her father, and her brother her entire life. But now Ruby finds herself in high school, and she's ready to move on with her life, including exploring an amazing God-given gift for singing. Coda, which stands for Children of Deaf Adults, tells a very compelling story, and it offers a glimpse to what the world is like for those who are hearing impaired. It got me to thinking about the power of a well-told story. I've been telling stories professionally for over 4 decades, first as a television reporter in the 70s and 80s, then as a college professor, these days as a pastor, an inspirational speaker and author, and even a podcaster. I know that data and information flood our digital world. Most of us suffer sensory overload, often saying things like, we just can't take any more information. But have you noticed we never say that about stories? Why? Storytelling builds connections between ideas and people. Storytelling brings information to life. Storytelling conveys culture and histories and experiences. Storytelling teaches values and acceptable behaviors. In fact, storytelling teaches many of us the difference between right and wrong. Here's the bottom line. Storytelling is the foundation of all human connection. Since the very beginning of time, we've communicated by telling stories. It's the way we were created. Our brains are designed to process in narrative form. In fact, for many people groups, the oral tradition is the only way we know our histories. This is true among families who may not have had access to other modes of communication. Such is the case with African Americans, among others. Since the institution of slavery, our histories have been passed along orally. In fact, friends, my doctoral work took advantage of the oral tradition. I used a research method called ethnography to gather data for my dissertation. Ethnography, a description of cultures and customs and practices and artifacts of people groups. I examined a critical turning point in the American Civil Rights Movement found in Birmingham, 1963. My work required interviewing surviving protesters and control agents, and also making sure that I took the time to document their stories, also interviewing various media representatives who covered those stories. I want to tell you something, friends. My discovery was amazing. This is what I discovered after my dissertation work. Now, I'm a college professor, and I'm teaching the American Civil Rights Movement through the lens of the media. I discovered that I could teach protest movements, and I could teach media studies, and I could teach them from books. Books that are great books that are in my library today, like David Garrow's Bearing the Cross, or Taylor Branch's Parting the Waters, or Juan Williams' Eyes on the Prize. I could teach from books, and the classes would have been good. They would have been interesting. Or I could take my students to Birmingham, Alabama. I could allow them to meet the ministers in the movement, the women who played vital roles in the movement. I could introduce my students to those children, protesters who marched, to the control agents who arrested them, to the black business owners who encouraged all of their patrons to continue in the fight for freedom. I could have introduced my students and did to those media members who covered the events. Here's the bottom line: the rich fabric woven by narratives from former participants in Birmingham produced wisdom and insights and nuances that book studies cannot offer. The classes were alive. They were filled with facts and data presented through the lens of human drama. I can tell you unequivocally, the power of a well-told story is the key to connecting with your audience. Let me say that again. The power of a well-told story is the key to connecting with your audience. You see, stories communicate values and experiences, but stories also communicate emotions. Here's good advice from motivational speaker Les Brown. Quote, "Don't just share information. If information could change people, everybody would be skinny, rich, and happy." End quote. Brown's words are spot on, considering that information only impacts two parts of the brain. These are the language processing parts where we decode words and turn those words into meaning. But storytelling affects every part of our brain because we think in narrative form, and we think in narrative form all day long. In fact, experts say we make up short stories in our heads for every action and even every conversation. In fact, researchers argue that personal stories and gossip make up the majority of our conversations. I want to pause here and offer a quick lesson in rhetorical theory. I used to love to teach rhetorical theory. My students weren't crazy about it, but I loved the history of communication. Rhetoric is not some bombastic term. Rhetoric means communication, even though it gets a bad and negative meaning in current pop culture. Rhetoric is the antiquated term for co-humanication, the process of communicating with other people. Listen to these philosophers and then listen to my translation. Francis Bacon said on one occasion, "The duty and office of rhetoric is to apply reason to imagination for the better moving of the will." Here's the translation: communicate in a way that ignites the imagination. Storytelling does that. Francis Bacon says that will move the will. Listen to what Aristotle said. Aristotle said that rhetoric, communication, is the faculty of discovering all available means of persuasion in a given instance. Storytelling has that element. I love watching a story that uses all available means of persuasion to communicate a particular message. Here's the translation: discover what will persuade and then teach your audience. Aristotle also taught that communication must have three elements. Communication must have ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos, credibility. Logos, a logical dimension. And pathos, emotion. That every communication must have those three elements. So let's sum up our rhetorical theory lesson with some simple words from Roman philosopher Cicero, who said, here's the goal of rhetoric: to teach, to please, and to move. That's it. In other words, according to Cicero, and I think he's spot on, a good story teaches us something. A good story pleases or gratifies us in some way. And a good story moves us. And when these elements are present in storytelling, we connect. We just connect with our audience in ways that we could not connect without a story. And that's the goal. John Maxwell said, everyone can communicate, but very few can connect. I'm talking about the power of a well-told story. Let's park right here. Do you want people to connect with your stories? Do you want them to remember what you say? Remember what Francis Bacon said? The duty and office of rhetoric is to apply reason to imagination to move the will. Oftentimes, people aren't listening to us because we don't give people a reason for which to listen. We must give them a reason that sparks their imagination so that their will can be moved. Let me give you an example. Just like you, every year I go to my doctor for a physical examination that includes taking lab tests, right? And I noticed something about me. I noticed that when the doctor walks into the examination room and says, Rick, I have your lab results, I perk right up. I don't need a listening coach. Listen, I don't need somebody encouraging me from the sidelines to listen. I perk up and I listen, friends. I listen attentively. I listen to every single word. Why? Because the doctor has given me a reason for which to listen. That reason, urgency. If you want people to listen to you, give them a reason for which to listen to you. So first, people will connect with your stories if you offer them a reason for which to listen. And then second, people will connect with your stories if the story teaches them something, if it pleases or gratifies them in some way, and if it moves them. Those three elements are very important. Something I picked up from 25 years of teaching is this. I discovered that when my students were gratified and responded in like fashion, they were willing to retain information a higher percentage of the time. And I discovered that they were gratified oftentimes when they discovered new knowledge or when they were reminiscing, right? Here's an example. I remember teaching a civil rights class, and I wanted my students to remember a particular year, let's say 1964. I wanted them to remember Freedom Summer in 1964 and all that took place during that pivotal year of the civil rights movement. So I wouldn't begin in the summer. I would begin, say, in February, because it was in February of 1964 that I was 8 years old. And I got a chance to stay up and watch something called The Ed Sullivan Show, because the Beatles would appear this night on The Ed Sullivan Show. And so as I'm teaching this class, I'm saying to my students, now, what is that group that debuted in 1964 and they would sing songs like, I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. And the students they're shouting all these answers that are wrong, like New Kids on the Block, like the Rolling Stones. And I would say, no. What was the name of that group? They had Prince Albert suits and they had salad bowl haircuts. And finally, I would acquiesce and say the Beatles. And they would sigh and laugh, but they would remember. When I gave my students an opportunity to learn new knowledge and to reminisce, it gratified them and the story stuck. Listen again. You want to tell stories that teach, that give people an opportunity to discover new knowledge, that pleases, that allows them to reminisce in my case. It gratifies them. And that story also must have the element of moving people. And people are moved oftentimes when they have a chance to reflect, or when the material or the story is so relevant that they can connect to the beliefs or the values, right? The one story that changed my life was the story of a third grade dropout. My dad, the wisest man I ever met in my life, my father. And he taught me very simple lessons that we've talked about over the years on this particular podcast, right? Perhaps his greatest lesson he taught me occurred on the worst day of my life as I stood in front of the casket of my first wife, holding the hands of my two boys. My father just whispered in my ear to keep standing, to just stand. I want you to think about how basic this story really is, but it's never about how basic the story is. Here's what it's about. Does the story have the elements that teach you something, that gratify you in some way, and that move you in some way? Trust me, friends, there's really nothing that unusual about my story. Parents who taught common sense, children who relied on that common sense, especially during the worst of times. But when you combine the elements of good storytelling, the story explodes. And so, my story, when combined with the elements that Cicero taught, teaches us the values of telling the truth, of thinking the best of people, of doing what you say you're going to do, teaches the values of being true to yourself, teaches the values of resilience, to just stand. My story pleased and gratified by allowing people to reminisce about their own childhood. You know what? Everywhere I go, people connect to my story and they will tell me similar values or lessons that were taught to them by their dad or by their mom. And my story moves from the journey of a college sweetheart to a sick wife, to her casket, and the devastation of death and despair, to the triumph of the human spirit to overcome. My story moves people, I believe. But friends, listen to me carefully. Everybody has a story. Everybody. And that's what I want you to remember. Now, your story may not produce over 300 million views, but trust me when I tell you that was never my intent. My goal was and is to encourage people, especially those who are heartbroken, those who have no hope, those who have no reason for which to hope. But let me remind you again, you have a story. Everybody has a story. And if you're being called to tell your story, don't forget to listen to the rhetorical voices of our past. Make sure you give people a reason to listen. This will ignite their imagination and move their will. And also, include Cicero's elements of good storytelling. Teach your audience. Please your audience. Move your audience. And finally, work on your story. Commit to working on your story daily. Friends, I have worked on my simple story every day, every single day for 30 years. In a future podcast, I will share in more detail what my routine is. But suffice to say, most of us are not willing to put in the work. In other words, most of us want to eat the meal. We just don't want to go shopping and buy the groceries and cook the meal. But good storytelling is like anything else. You have to dedicate yourself to your craft. I love what Alabama football coach Nick Saban said on one occasion. He said, "It's not about what you want. It's about what you're willing to do to get it." So remember the words of Les Brown. Don't just share information. If information could change people, everybody would be skinny, rich, and happy. Information only impacts two areas of the brain, but a good story impacts the entire brain. I want you to think about that this day and make it your goal today to tell a story with Cicero's elements to teach and to please and to move. You just might be surprised how many people are gratified and how many will remember what you have to say. Well, friends, that's going to do it for this episode. Until we meet again, this is Dr. Rick asking the most important question I can ask. How you living?
Are you ready to make an impact in your world right now? Do you want to stop existing and start living your best life right now? Dr. Rick wants to give you the first chapter of his best-selling book, Lessons from a Third Grade Dropout, absolutely free. Just go to www.rickrigsby.com/free gift to get the print or audiobook right now.
This is the podcastfactory.com.